What if the most dangerous thing Ursula von der Leyen ever did wasn't a policy, wasn't a regulation, wasn't a backroom deal? It was a secret she kept buried so deep inside the Brussels machine that even her closest allies had no idea it existed, until Giorgia Meloni found it. On March 18, 2026, in a closed-door session that was never supposed to become public, Italy's prime minister walked into a room full of Europe's most powerful leaders and detonated information so explosive that 3 senior commission officials submitted resignation letters before the meeting was even over. Von der Leyen sat at the head of that table and watched 20 years of carefully constructed political armor crack in real time. What Meloni revealed in that room didn't just expose one woman's secrets. It exposed the entire system that Brussels has been running behind Europe's back for over a decade. And once you understand what was hidden, you will never look at the European Union the same way again. To understand what Meloni exposed, you have to understand what von der Leyen has been protecting. The European Commission under her leadership was never just an administrative body managing trade rules and environmental standards. It became something far more powerful and far more dangerous. A shadow government operating above the democratic process, making decisions that affect 450 million people without ever asking a single one of them for permission. Von der Leyen built this machine piece by piece, appointment by appointment, regulation by regulation, and she was extraordinarily careful about keeping the mechanics hidden from public view. She understood that the moment ordinary Europeans saw exactly how decisions were being made inside the Berlaymont building, the entire structure would collapse under the weight of its own illegitimacy. So she kept it hidden. She buried the evidence inside thousands of pages of technical directives that nobody reads. She routed critical decisions through obscure committee processes that generate no headlines. She cultivated a media environment in which questioning Brussels became synonymous with being a dangerous nationalist threat to European unity. For years, this system worked perfectly. Leaders who challenged her got isolated. Countries that resisted her agenda got threatened with financial penalties. Politicians who asked the wrong questions in the European Parliament got drowned out by procedural maneuvers that made genuine debate impossible. Von der Leyen sat at the center of this web and convinced herself that she had built something permanent. She was wrong. What Meloni uncovered goes directly to the heart of how the European Commission has been managing, or more accurately, manipulating economic data to justify its policy agenda. For years, Brussels has been publishing reports, projections, and assessments that paint a picture of European economic health that simply does not match reality on the ground. The competitiveness numbers that the Commission circulates to member state governments, the ones used to justify everything from the Green Deal mandates to fiscal austerity requirements, have been systematically adjusted to hide the true scale of Europe's economic decline. This isn't a matter of interpretation or political disagreement about methodology. Meloni's team obtained internal Commission documents drafted by the Commission's own economists that show the gap between what Brussels publishes publicly and what its own analysts are actually finding in the data. The internal assessments are devastating. European manufacturing competitiveness has declined twice as fast as the official figures suggest. Energy costs across the Eurozone are running at levels that the Commission's published reports understate by margins that would be considered fraudulent in any private sector context. Youth unemployment in Southern Europe, already a humanitarian crisis by any honest measure, is being tracked internally at numbers that are significantly higher than what appears in the official Eurostat releases that journalists and policymakers rely on. Von der Leyen's commission has been running 2 sets of books, one set for public consumption, designed to support the narrative that her policies are working and that Europe just needs more patience and more commitment to the Brussels agenda, and another set for internal use, showing the real numbers that her policy team uses when they're actually making decisions behind closed doors. The implications of this are staggering, and they go far beyond a simple accusation of statistical manipulation. If the economic data that member state governments have been receiving from Brussels is systematically distorted, then every budget decision, every social policy, every infrastructure investment that national governments have made over the past several years has been based on a false picture of economic reality. Greece, which suffered through years of brutal austerity based on Brussels' assessments of its fiscal position, may have been operating under conditions far more severe than the Commission ever acknowledged publicly. Italy, which has been repeatedly lectured about its debt levels and threatened with enforcement procedures, has been making fiscal decisions based on growth projections that the Commission's own internal models indicated were wildly optimistic. Spain, Portugal, and the entire southern European periphery have been asked to sacrifice in terms of public services, social programs, and economic opportunity, based on numbers that don't hold up against the Commission's own internal analysis. This is not bureaucratic incompetence. Bureaucratic incompetence produces random errors that go in different directions. What Meloni's documents show is a systematic pattern of adjustments that consistently favor the narrative Brussels wants to tell, which means this is a deliberate choice, not a mistake. When Meloni stood up in that closed session and placed the internal documents on the table in front of Europe's assembled leaders, the room went silent in a way that had nothing to do with diplomatic courtesy. It went silent because every single leader in that room understood immediately what they were looking at. They understood that their own finance ministers and economic advisors had been working with corrupted information. They understood that the policy fights they had been having with Brussels for years, the arguments about growth forecasts and deficit limits and investment capacity, had been conducted on a playing field that was never level, because Brussels controlled the data, and Brussels had been manipulating the data. The anger in that room was not partisan. It was not a North versus South reaction or a nationalist versus federalist reaction. It was the fury of people who suddenly realized they had been systematically deceived by an institution they were supposed to be equal partners with. Von der Leyen attempted to respond. She attempted to characterize the documents as preliminary working papers that don't reflect the Commission's official positions. She attempted to argue that internal modeling always produces a range of scenarios, and that selecting the most accurate scenario for publication is standard practice. She attempted to suggest that Meloni had cherry-picked documents out of context to create a misleading impression. But the leaders in that room were not journalists who could be managed with careful talking points. They were heads of government with their own economic teams, their own access to data, their own gnawing suspicion that the numbers coming out of Brussels never quite matched what their own analysts were telling them. Von der Leyen's explanations didn't land. They collapsed on contact with the reality that everyone in that room was now confronting simultaneously. And here is where the story stops being about data manipulation and becomes about something far more consequential. Because the documents Meloni presented didn't just show that Brussels had been adjusting economic figures. They showed why. Embedded in the internal Commission communications that Meloni's team obtained were explicit discussions about the political sensitivity of certain data points and the need to manage the public release of economic assessments in ways that would not undermine support for key Commission initiatives. In plain language, senior Commission officials were having conversations about how to present economic data in ways that protected the political viability of von der Leyen's agenda. The Green Deal, the digital single market, the fiscal framework, all of these flagship programs have been supported by economic assessments that the Commission's own internal communications reveal were shaped, at least in part, by the political need to make those programs look viable. This is the secret that von der Leyen spent years making sure would never see daylight. Not just that the numbers were wrong, but that the numbers were wrong on purpose to protect a political agenda that the actual economic data would not support. And Meloni didn't just find this secret. She walked it into the most powerful room in Europe and laid it bare in front of every leader who had been deceived by it. But what happened in the hours after that meeting ended is where this story becomes truly explosive. And what von der Leyen did next reveals just how far she is willing to go to protect what remains of her crumbling authority. The moment that closed session ended, von der Leyen's crisis machine activated at full speed. Within 30 minutes of the final handshake, Commission communication staff were already on phones with Brussels-based journalists, planting the narrative that Meloni had staged a political stunt using documents stripped of their proper context. Within 2 hours, 3 major European news outlets published remarkably similar stories, questioning the authenticity of the internal Commission papers. The coordination was so obvious, so mechanical, so perfectly timed that it actually backfired. Because the leaders who had been sitting in that room when Meloni presented the documents were watching the same news cycle, and they could see with their own eyes that what Brussels was telling the press bore no resemblance to what had actually happened in front of them. Von der Leyen's media operation, which had successfully managed every previous crisis by controlling the information environment, ran directly into an obstacle it had never faced before: witnesses. Credible, powerful, unimpeachable witnesses who had no reason to protect Brussels and every reason to be furious at it. The cover-up attempt didn't just fail, it confirmed everything Meloni had argued, because an institution with nothing to hide does not mobilize its entire communications apparatus within 30 minutes of a closed meeting to discredit the person who asked the hardest questions. Von der Leyen just proved Meloni's case for her. But the communications failure was only the beginning of the collapse, because what happened next inside the Commission itself made the cover-up look like the least of von der Leyen's problems. How deep does this go? And how many other secrets is Brussels still successfully hiding from the governments that are supposed to be its equal partners? If what Meloni exposed in that room is only the beginning, then what comes next will shake the European Union to its absolute foundation. The leaders who sat in that closed session are not staying silent. The documents are not going back into the drawer. And von der Leyen is running out of allies fast enough to matter. This story is moving at a speed that Brussels cannot control and cannot contain. Hit that subscribe button right now, because the next developments in this collapse are coming faster than anyone in Brussels is prepared for. Drop a comment below and tell me, do you think von der Leyen survives this, or is her time finally up? Your answer matters, because 450 million Europeans are about to find out whether their union was ever really built for them, or built to keep them manageable. Don't just watch this unfold. Be part of the conversation that decides what Europe becomes next.